Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the gritty, sensory, and honestly perilous world of Renaissance Europe. We're looking at a part of daily life you might think of as trivial, but back then, it dictated medical survival, social hierarchy, and even political warfare. We're talking about hair. In the Renaissance, the head was a fiercely policed canvas, and managing it was a complex, highly performative act that really defined a person's entire existence.
Wait until it gets hot and then remove it quickly before the flesh falls off. Now, that's not some grim excerpt from a medieval torture manual. It's actually a genuine, highly sought-after 16th century beauty recipe for a chemical hair removal paste. This rather terrifying instruction perfectly sets the stage for us today, showing that achieving the Renaissance beauty ideal meant ordinary women were routinely risking severe physical trauma.
Section 1. The humoral biology of hair.
To really understand these extreme practices, we've got to look at their biological reality. Renaissance medicine operated on galenic humoral theory. The medical consensus was that human health was entirely governed by the balance of four internal fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So physicians didn't see hair as just an aesthetic feature. They actually categorized it as a physiological excrement, literally a metabolic waste product. They believed that as your stomach digested food, it created these hot, moist vapors. Those vapors would travel all the way up to the brain, look for an exit through the pores of the scalp, and then solidify the second they hit the cool outside air, forming a hair shaft. So your hair's color, texture, and thickness wasn't about genetics. It was a direct public broadcast of your internal medical state.
Because they viewed the body this way, their approach to hygiene was radically different from ours. Today, we use water to wash away external dirt. But in the Renaissance, hair care was seen as a dangerous medical procedure meant to manage those internal brain vapors. Physicians actually terrified women into avoiding hot water. They warned that washing your head with hot water would forcefully open the skin's pores. And in a world before germ theory, open pores were basically an open door for disease-carrying miasmas and cold air to invade the brain. Washing your hair was considered so physically taxing and dangerous that doctors told women to avoid it entirely during menstruation or pregnancy, warning it could trigger a miscarriage or severe illness.
Section 2. Hygiene, parasites, and mercury. So without running water, how did they stay clean? Both elites and commoners relied on this incredibly laborious, highly structured dry cleaning regimen. First, you detangle your hair using the wide-toothed side of a bone or wooden comb. Next, you'd flip it around and forcefully scrape your scalp with the extremely fine-toothed side. And the goal here wasn't to strip away the natural oils or sebum. Instead, you were physically lifting dust and then pulling that oil down the hair shaft to act as a protective, healthy conditioner. Third, to manage the grease, you'd apply absorbent, aromatic powders straight to the roots, things like crushed rosemary, lavender, and dried rose petals. Finally, you'd vigorously rub the scalp with dry linen cloths. It was a massively labor-intensive daily reality.
But what happened when that humoral balance failed? Well, the results were catastrophic. You see, Renaissance physicians didn't think head lice were external bugs you just caught from a neighbor. They believed lice spontaneously generated from within the human head. The idea was that if your body harbored an excess of internal cranial moisture or stagnant bodily vapors, it literally produced lice. Medical texts even warned people that eating certain foods, like figs or chestnuts, would increase your brain moisture and actively cause a louse infestation.
So if the infestation is coming from inside your body, how on earth do you treat it? 827 parts per million. That is the staggering amount of toxic mercury modern researchers discovered in the mummified hair of King Ferdinand II of Aragon, who ruled Naples in the late 15th century. To treat severe chronic lice infestations, physicians would apply massive, lethal doses of mercury directly to the scalp as a topical medicine. It's a really stark reminder of the deadly constraints of Renaissance medicine.
Section 3. The toxic golden ideal. The absolute pinnacle of Renaissance beauty. The look you see celebrated in endless Petrarchian love poems and Botticelli paintings was strawberry blonde hair paired with pristine, pale skin. But natural blondness is genetically pretty rare in Southern Europe, so women engaged in elaborate chemical alchemy to force their hair to match this ideal. They used incredibly caustic ingredients to chemically strip their hair pigments. We're talking rock alum, caustic sulfur, exotic resins like dragon's blood and saffron. And if a woman needed to darken her graying hair, Well, a very popular recipe involved cutting the heads and tails off green lizards, crushing them up, and cooking them in oil. Achieving this golden ideal took immense physical endurance. Venetian women, for example, were famous for their bleaching techniques. They would climb up to the altana, the wooden roof terraces of their homes, right in the middle of the suffocating Italian summer heat. They'd soak their hair in these caustic, sulfurous solutions and just sit there in the blazing sun. But because tan skin was strictly forbidden for the elite, they wore something called a solana. It was a wide-brimmed hat with the crown completely cut out. So they'd pull their chemically soaked hair up through the hole, spreading it over the brim to bake into golden threads, all while that wide brim kept their faces fashionably pale.
Section 4. Arsenic and high foreheads. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the ultimate status symbol for a woman was a massive, completely hairless, wrinkle-free, artificial receding forehead. It was meant to project an aura of elite intelligence, nobility, and virginal purity. To achieve this deeply unnatural look, women would brutally pluck and tweeze their hairlines back inch by inch. Then, to hide the stubble and smooth the skin out, they'd aggressively rub their raw hairlines with pumice stones. Prominent cosmetic manuals even suggested applying pastes made of vinegar and cat feces to permanently stop the hair from growing back. For widespread hair removal, many women relied on a chemical sludge known as ruzma, and the sensory reality of applying this was truly harrowing. First, you'd sit in a stifling steam bath to force your skin's pores open. Second, you'd smear a paste made of slaked lime and natural arsenic trisulfide directly onto your forehead. Third, you wait exactly 3 to 5 agonizing minutes as it literally begins to burn. Step 4 was the test. You dip a bird's feather into the paste on your head. If the chemical was strong enough that the feather's plumes melted instantly, the reaction was complete. Finally, you'd frantically wash it off with cold water. If you were even a minute too slow, this caustic mixture would melt right through the dermis, causing deep tissue ulcerations and systemic arsenic poisoning. It makes you wonder, what would you risk to achieve the perfect high forehead? It's crucial to understand that these women weren't just blindly vain. They were living within incredibly rigid, unforgiving social structures, where a woman's physical appearance was tied directly to her honor, her marital prospects, and ultimately her family's political standing. They risked permanent disfigurement and systemic poisoning because society absolutely demanded it of them.
Section 5. The political power of headwear.
Once chemically altered and agonizingly plucked, hair essentially became architectural and deeply political. In Milan, for instance, the quazzone was an absolute engineering marvel. It was this incredibly thick, braided tail supported by a rear cap called a transale. It was explicitly designed to distribute the heavy weight of false hair and jewels so it wouldn't strain the forehead. Over in Florence, elite brides wore the vespaio, or wasp's nest. This was a delicate grid of pearls and rubies, where the pearls explicitly telegraphed virginal purity and the rubies signaled passion and immense dowry wealth. Meanwhile, in Germany, noblewomen would completely contain their hair within the Flinderhobe. This was a massive, bulbous cap covered in metal spangles, which physically projected extreme wealth while simultaneously enforcing strict religious and moral discipline over the body. Because these hairstyles were so visibly tied to wealth, they actually terrified the established social order. As merchants grew richer, they started mimicking the nobility. To put a stop to this social mobility, city governments across Europe enacted sumptuary laws. They legally dictated exactly how many pearls, what colors of silk, and what type of hairnets a woman was allowed to wear based entirely on her husband or father's social rank. The goal was to protect family capital from being drained on luxury goods. And the enforcement? It was brutal. Specialized state officials patrolled churches and markets, and they were legally empowered to physically rip forbidden pearl nets right out of a woman's hair. In cities like Bologna, violations could even lead to excommunication, meaning you were completely cut off from the church and society simply for wearing the wrong hairpiece. But the most powerful women learned exactly how to weaponize this system. In 1491, Beatriz de Este brought the quazzone to Milan to project her Spanish dynastic alliances. When she died a few years later, the trend died right along with her. But then, her sister Isabella de Este, who was often called a Machiavellian in skirts, invented the capigliera in 1509. It was this massive, turban-like structure made of faux hair and jewels. Isabella basically used her hair to assert diplomatic sovereignty. She actively subverted those sumptuary laws by creating trends so wildly complex that only her absolute inner circle could replicate them. She even went as far as dressing up fashion dolls in her custom headwear and shipping them across Europe to foreign courts. She was quite literally using hair as soft power to negotiate diplomatic alliances during the turbulent Italian wars. So the Renaissance scalp was never just a passive biological feature. It was a fiercely contested battleground of humoral medicine, lethal cosmetics, sumptuary laws, and diplomatic genius. It leaves us with a fascinating thought. If hair was once considered a medical vulnerability and a political weapon, what does the way we manage, modify, and police our own bodies say about the values, constraints, and anxieties of our civilization today? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I hope you enjoyed the journey.